Fellows, members and guests, good evening. My name's Hélène Menagé. I am a dermatologist and a trustee of the Royal Society of Medicine. Now, tonight is an anniversary event. This 42nd In Conversation Live is an anniversary event. It is exactly 1 year ago, at the start of lockdown 1, that the first of such events was held virtually. And it has been a challenging year for all. I'm sure you'd wish to join me in thanking Professor Simon Wesley, Professor Roger Kirby, and all the staff of the Royal Society of Medicine for keeping the show on the road. We are privileged to have as our guest this evening, Lady Suzanne Heywood. Lady Heywood, good evening.
Good evening.
If you'd asked Lady Heywood what her husband did, she would have told you he's the man who runs Downing Street. Her late husband, as well as being the Cabinet Secretary, was head of the Domestic Civil Service. He sadly passed away on the 4th of November 2018 of metastatic lung cancer. Lady Heywood has recently published a biography, which we have here in front of us, of his life, their life, and his time in the civil service. It is said that behind every man who achieves greatness, there is a woman. Lady Heywood left Somerville College, Oxford, with a degree in zoology and has a PhD from Cambridge. She joined the Treasury fast stream, where she met her husband, and left to become an associate and then senior partner at McKinsey's. In 2016, she became MD of Exor and executive chairman and acting CEO of CNH Industrials. And that's a company that designs, manufactures and sells equipment for agriculture and construction. She is a board member of The Economist and sits on their audit committee and deputy chair of the Royal Opera House. Lady Heywood is also mother to 3 children, the youngest of whom are twins. She has published a book on operational model change, a book called Reorg, which I have to admit I have not read, Lady Heywood. And she's published a biography of her late mother-in-law. The cover of this book was designed by her twins. Now, Lady Heywood, we would like you to discuss your biography on Lord Heywood. At the time of his appointment as Cabinet Secretary, he was described by the BBC as quite the most important person this country has never heard of. Tell us, please, a little bit about how you came to write his story.
Thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, so much for inviting me to talk this evening. I really appreciate it. And this was a book that I'd always intended to write at some point. I mean, Jeremy was lucky enough to have an amazing career working for 4 different prime ministers. He worked for Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, David Cameron with Nick Clegg, and then David Cameron on his own, and then Mrs. May. So he had an extraordinary career. He was very lucky in that. And I always wanted to write that story. But my intention had been to write that story well after he retired, because I thought it was a story that was worth telling. Partly because many people don't really understand what a civil servant does. I mean, people do understand what a minister does. I think the civil service is less understood. So it was an opportunity to explain the civil service, but also to explain what it was like to work under all those different administrations. Sadly, back in 2017, Jeremy, as you mentioned in your introduction, was diagnosed with lung cancer. And sadly, that was stage 3, and it kind of progressed to stage 4 quite quickly. So I knew if I was going to write this book and be able to write this book with his input in it, which of course would make it a completely different and incredibly rich book, then I had to do it, and I had to do it then. And that's how I came to write it. And we had a year basically working on it together. I mean, I was writing, but I was talking to him the whole time, interviewing people. And then I had about a year and a half afterwards when I was editing the book and trying to get it into a fit state to publish it.
And I understand that the publication was slightly delayed, Lady Heywood, by the publication of David Cameron's biography.
That's right. So at the point at which I started writing the book, David Cameron was writing his biography of his time in office. And so what I agreed with the Cabinet Office is I would wait until that had come out. And actually, I waited until the paperback edition of that came out as well, which I'm sure Jeremy would have wanted me to do, because given that David Cameron was already well underway on that, I didn't want to kind of jump ahead of it. But it also gave me time, I think, as well, to reflect in more detail on the book. I think it improved in the last few readings through. It's a good lesson, actually. You always think you finish something, and then another couple of reads through, and it definitely gets better.
Well, it's a very readable book, and I hope members of the audience will have the chance to experience that for themselves. Now, it's, I believe, a little unusual for Mandarins to have biographies. I think Robin Butler, who served under Thatcher and Blair, had something published, an autobiography, but it is a little unusual. Could you tell us a little bit about the constraints of writing about people in such prominent public position?
Yes, certainly. I mean, there are many books, many biographies that are written of civil servants. Of course, we're all very familiar of biographies that are written, or autobiographies that are written of diplomats. Many have been written, and of many different civil servants. Many people have been in number 10, ministers, special advisors, but also, all sorts of other people have kind of written books. And I think it's very important, because I think it's important to explain how government works. However, I was very conscious when I wrote the book that I needed to be careful not to put anything in, clearly nothing that would be an issue from a national security point of view. But also, there is a danger when you write a book like this that you're not aware of the things that you can't put in. So I actually did submit it to the Cabinet Office, although I wasn't technically, I didn't technically need to go through their process, but I actually gave them. And because of the time which I was giving till I published it, I gave them about a year and a half, which gave them lots and lots of time to go through, and they gave me lots of comments, all of which I kind of pondered, most of which I kind of took on board. And that I felt was a very helpful process, mainly, as I say, because although I wasn't intending to put anything in which would be at all kind of problematic, sometimes you don't realize that you're putting something in that might be problematic. And actually, most of the amendments, the vast majority of them, I was able to do without really taking out things of substance, things that Jeremy really wanted to be able to talk about.
And I believe there was a little controversy about, I'll use the word stress testing, but Jeremy wanted to stress test the impact of negotiating with Europe, of failing in our negotiations, of calling a vote, and stress testing the impact that might have of leaving Europe. But that in fact did not happen, did it? Although he suggested perhaps.
Well, so I put in the book the fact that Jeremy sent a memo to the Prime Minister, to David Cameron, shortly before David Cameron decided to call the referendum, or make a promise to call the referendum. Actually, I think the fact that he wrote a memo to David Cameron about that is not particularly controversial. I mean, I would expect a civil servant to kind of write such a memo. I think, the important thing, and this is kind of said over and over again in the book, is that civil servants advise, but ministers decide. Ministers are elected by the people, civil servants aren't. But it is important that civil servants provide advice on the consequences of decisions that ministers make. And so what Jeremy was doing was not, he certainly wasn't saying it's a good idea to call the referendum or not call the referendum. What he was doing was laying out some of the consequences for things like inward investment once the referendum was called. And I think that's the sort of thing that you would expect a civil servant to put forward.
Thank you. So it's a delicate, you've sort of touched on it, but if you could expand on it a little bit more, please. So the balance, what the civil service actually does, the delicate balance between the politicians and the civil service, and the difference between political choice versus policy.
Yes, I mean, one of the reasons for writing the book was to try and bring to life what the civil service does. And I found it fascinating, actually. When I interviewed a lot of people for the book. So obviously I interviewed Jeremy a lot, but I also interviewed almost 200 other people as I wrote the book, basically kind of eyewitnesses to the events, all different sorts of people, everybody from ministers and prime ministers down to quite junior people, so that I could, often in one, for one event or one story, I would have multiple different perspectives. One of the things that I realized when I was interviewing people, particularly, when I was interviewing non-civil servants, is that people, even people you would think understand how the civil service works, don't. Some people believe that it is quite a kind of passive organization. A minister will decide that they're going to go in a certain direction, and the civil service, in quite a kind of responsive but kind of passive way, will then work out what to do. Some people believe the civil service is a very Machiavellian organization, kind of plotting in a kind of yes minister type sense. How am I going to get the elected government to do what I want the elected government to do? The reality is in the middle, and because it's in the middle, with all the nuances of being in the middle, it's, I think it's helpful to bring it to life through the stories. I mean, Jeremy was certainly active in creating and suggesting policy. He wasn't passive. He wasn't sitting waiting to be told what to do. But ministers always decide. So he would be actively suggesting things. He would actively suggest alternative to things. He would certainly suggest how things should be implemented. He would raise issues, but ministers would always decide. And I think, that's the important differentiation, is that, ministers are elected, well, MPs are elected by the people, and the MPs elect the ministers, decide on the ministers. The civil service is not an elected body, so it serves the government of the day.
So it's a delicate balance, and it needs skilled individuals to handle it well. And with regards to that balance, it's been, we'll discuss the events that have been squidging and leaking all over the Sunday Times this weekend, which is the Greensill issue and debt funding tendering. So tell us a little bit about that, because Jeremy was a believer, I believe, and I hope you don't mind me calling him Jeremy. You very kindly agreed. Fine. But I think he was a believer in public private partnership. So tell us a bit about debt funding tendering.
Yes, so one of the things, I guess it kind of really kind of feeds on from what I was just saying before. One of the things that Jeremy considered was part of his job, a really important part of his job, particularly when he became cabinet secretary, was to find new ideas for the civil service. I mean, he always believed there was a better way to do things, and that that the civil service always needed to be reformed. He was always on the lookout for ideas. I used to joke that, Jeremy never came away from a kind of dinner party or an event or even a kind of conversation without having some new idea, some new person that he found that he thought might be interesting, or a new idea or a new kind of connection. Many of those I've kind of listed in the book. Actually, Greensill, funnily enough, is not one I listed in the book, just because it was one of many, many examples of where Jeremy was looking for a way to bring a new way of thinking into government. And Lex Greensill was somebody who he met when he was working at Morgan Stanley, and he had an idea around supply chain funding, which basically, put simply, means that you can pay your suppliers more quickly. So if you take something like pharmacies, it takes government quite a while to pay pharmacies, and I'm no expert on this, I should kind of say up front, and I was not involved in any way in the design of this, but my understanding is that it takes some time to pay pharmacies, because they have to submit all of their paperwork, and that all has to be processed by the government. But of course, if you're a pharmacy, as many people listening here will know, most of them are independent businesses, and therefore, from a working capital point of view, waiting while that funding is being paid can be very, very difficult if you're a small business. So the supply chain kind of financing basically means that you're paid up front. There's a private sector bank that's involved that, pays up front, and then it's reconciled once all of the kind of paperwork comes through afterwards. So let's have this idea about supply chain funding. Jeremy kind of brought him into government to think about whether there were areas in government where that would be helpful. And one of the areas was in pharmacies. And my understanding is that that kind of contract went, it didn't go to kind of Brexit, it went back to, I think it went to Citibank, which Lex had kind of worked out, but prior to him coming into government. So for me, it's an example of kind of Jeremy bringing somebody into government to try and look at how to make things work better.
I think it goes without saying that we would all agree that government should pay particularly its small and its medium suppliers promptly. How much of an influence, Lady Heywood, did you have? Difficult question this, but did you have on Jeremy? I've sort of got a question in the chat with regards to that. How much did you influence his thoughts, his policies? His ideas is the word. How much did you influence his ideas?
Well, I mean, as I said before, Jeremy, I mean, I use the analogy in the book of Jeremy being a bit of a magpie. He was always looking for people who had interesting ideas. And so, we often kind of talked about things, not kind of confidential things while they were happening, but, a lot of kind of day-to-day things that were going on. And he was forever quizzing me about the world that I was living in. I mean, for a lot of this time, I was moving up the ranks within McKinsey. And there's quite a few things that he, if you like, kind of acquired from McKinsey and brought into government. I mean, things like McKinsey publishes the McKinsey Quarterly, which is a very good publication, which contains within it all of McKinsey's best research and thinking. And Jeremy took that idea and created something called the Civil Service Quarterly. He didn't make much attempt, as you can see, to kind of conceal where he got the idea from. And that still exists. So I do think that in some ways I influenced what he did. He certainly kind of took a number of ideas from what I did. And I think, like many couples, we did bounce issues off each other. When he was facing something difficult at work, we would talk it over at home and kind of ponder it. And he would do the same for me. And I think that's very, very valuable. And I think it's one of the strengths of having a couple where both work, or both work in a kind of similar sort of environment. So you understand it I understood enough of what his world was like to be a sounding board. But of course, it was always up to him what he was going to do, and he understood the context far better than I did.
He strongly encouraged you to go back to work after the twins were born. That must have been extremely difficult. I think one of the hardest things women do is to go back to work after maternity leave. But you say in the book, he said to you, once you're there, it'll be fine.
That's right, and he was right. I mean, and I do think there is a moment, and I'm sure kind of many other women have experienced this as well. You have. I had our oldest Johnny, and then I had the twins, and both times I kind of fell completely in love with the baby and then babies, and the kind of temptation to stay at home with these kind of lovely, adorable kind of babies, well, at least they were, as long as they slept a reasonable amount, was quite overwhelming. But I think Jeremy knew me almost better than I knew myself, and he knew that, fundamentally I would be a kind of happier, more satisfied person working and combining working with being a mother than if I was just, just is not the right word, but if I was a kind of full-time parent. And that's not in any way to say that that would have been a bad choice. For many people, that's entirely the right choice. But for me personally, I think he was right. I think I've always enjoyed, being lucky enough to be able to have a career alongside being a mother.
Now, you've had a very unusual, we've touched on your professional career, but you've had a very, very unusual childhood, which I hope you'll tell. You're writing a book on it, and that'll be exciting. But we'll just ask you to touch a little bit about that, because when you were 6, your parents took your brother and yourself off on a ship called Wave Walker to trace the third journey of Captain. Was the third journey his last journey?
That's right. That's right.
I hope it didn't end. It nearly ended as his journey for you, didn't it? It nearly ended, unfortunately, for you. So tell us about it.
It did. I mean, when I was 7 years old, my father decided that he was going to sail around the world with my brother, who was a year younger than me, 6, and my mother. And we set sail. When we set sail, I think we had kind of 2 crew on board. So we set sail from Plymouth, and we sailed down to South America, across to Africa, across the Indian Ocean to Australia. We were shipwrecked halfway across, which is another kind of story. And then up around the South Pacific and around the South Pacific for a number of further years. And in total, I was on the boat for 9, almost 10 years. So most of my childhood. And I only came back to the UK to go to university. And in fact, I decided at some point during this voyage, because the first part I quite enjoyed, apart from being shipwrecked. But as I became a teenager, particularly an older teenager, I became very frustrated by it, because I couldn't go to school, you couldn't have kind of permanent friendships, and you were trapped on a boat. And a boat is a very small, I mean, actually it was quite a big boat, but even a big boat is quite a small space to be stuck in for years on end. And I decided that the way to get myself out of that was to educate myself out of that, which is what I did. And I eventually got a place in university to come back to England and go to university. And that's what I did.
You educated yourself by correspondence, is that right?
That's right, by post.
So but post in the middle of the Pacific or the Indian Ocean, the Southern Indian Ocean, I believe.
That's right. It's quite tricky to educate yourself by post when you're on a boat, because the problem with educating yourself by post on a boat is you don't have an address, because we were sailing from one place to another. So I would say to my father, where are we going to go next? And he would go, we're going to go to Papua, we're going to go to American Samoa, we're going to go to Fiji, we're going to go to Vilo and Vanuatu. And so I would dutifully kind of post off my lessons and say, please send them back to kind of post restant at wherever, next place, Honiara, Solomon Islands. And most of the time that worked, but quite often it didn't, because the wind would change direction and we'd end up we wouldn't go to the Solomon Islands. Suddenly we would go to somewhere else. Or we would arrive there and the kind of letters hadn't come back and then we had to leave. So a lot of my lessons I never got back. Most of my teachers I never met in person. And of course it was before the internet, and we didn't really have a kind of radio connection. So it was pretty hard to get an education. But
did you manage to do it? How were you down below, sort of reading when the ship was tossing and turning? It must have been.
Yeah, no, I was. And the other kind of tricky thing on a small boat is you haven't got any personal space. So we had one table which only kind of sat about kind of 5 people. We normally had anything up to 10 people on board, because my parents started taking kind of paying crew on board to kind of pay for the voyage. I had one bunk, but bunks on a boat you can't sit up in because they're too low, and you have multiple bunks in a cabin anyway. So it was very, you don't have any space to work. And I was also expected to kind of help work on the boat, kind of act as crew, kind of sailing and kind of cooking. And so it was tough, kind of not very much time, no kind of private space. And as you say, a lot of the time the boat kind of going back and forth and, but I do think that I kind of came out of it with a lot of things that have served me well since. I mean, the main thing being a huge amount of resilience. And I think, people who've come from childhoods like that do come out often with resilience, and that kind of stands you in good stead later on.
You also came out, Lady Heywood, with visuospatial skills, with sort of good right hemisphere skills. You refer to Jeremy having had, you were screwing together the IKEA changing table. So congratulations, that's quite an achievement. And also you mentioned on your first maternity leave going up to help the roofer. So, it's not every woman who has in her skill set to read zoology at Oxford and screw together the IKEA changing table. I mean, I'm not, lots of women do, but not everybody does. So were those innate, or did you learn those from being on the ship?
Well, I mean, it's hard to tell, but the thing with living on a boat is you can't bring somebody up to fix something when things go wrong. So you learn how to fix them. So I grew up learning how to fix things. I mean, I once helped my dad build a mast. It has to be said, he did most of the work, but building a mast is it's probably the most complicated thing I've ever been involved in doing, because you have to splice multiple pieces of wood together, otherwise it will snap. I grew up kind of knowing how to change the oil in an engine. As you said, when we bought our second house and we'd slightly kind of overextended ourselves and then realized that the roof was leaking, I found a roofer who came to live with us for a number of weeks, and I went and sat on the roof with him and helped him. So yes, you kind of come out of these experiences with kind of skills which turn out to be incredibly useful. And Jeremy, I have to say, was completely the opposite. I mean, as I make clear in the book, Jeremy was a man who was incredibly clever, incredibly dedicated to what he did, absolutely useless on all kind of practical points. He couldn't drive a car, couldn't cook, wasn't kind of brilliant at kind of stuff on the internet. I mean, he basically was incredibly good at what he was doing, and a very kind of kind man. But very, very unpractical.
I've got a question here, which I'm going to ask you. It's from Eleanor Lewis. I'm a civil servant. Jeremy was an inspirational leader and a genuinely nice man. Did Jeremy mention any successes? Well, can you answer that?
Well, I mean, so I think one of the things that Jeremy was very keen to do when he was there was to start to build a kind of cohort of successors. And there's a number of civil servants who he hugely admired within the civil service, many of which now are in quite senior positions. I mean, Simon Case, for example, who is the cabinet secretary now, was one of Jeremy's mentees, and we'll kind of say that he was one of Jeremy's mentees. He worked with Jeremy in Number 10. Mark Sebwell, of course, who took over from Jeremy, he and Jeremy worked very closely together when Jeremy was in Number 10. So I think there were a good 20 or 30 at the kind of next couple of levels down from Jeremy, who Jeremy thought were very strong civil servants coming through. One of the things that he was very passionate about, though, was increasing civil service diversity, which is, still has a long way to go. And I think one of his regrets at having stepped down when he did was something that he'd only partly achieved.
And just with regards to his stepping down, there's another question here, slightly challenging question from Mike Fry. He says, fascinating book, by the way, we agree. I understand Jeremy continued working right up to the end of his life. On reflection, do you think that was a wise thing to do? And in fact, what happened was, if I've read the book correctly, is that he resigned as a head of the civil service and cabinet secretary about a week before he died. Although he did offer to step down prior to that. And I think you've mentioned when he had metastases in his spine and he had an unstable spine. And he was sort of, he went in to work and virtually sort of, had a catastrophic episode and got cross with you for booking a scan when he had an important meeting that afternoon. So could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one thing that I realized, Jeremy had a diagnosis and I knew, and he knew right from the start, that this was a kind of terminal illness and that this was he had limited time. We didn't know quite how long. It's one of those conversations, I'm sure the kind of people listening to this have far more expertise on this than I do, but you're not told exactly how long, but you very quickly work out approximately how long. And I knew it was, somewhere between a year, probably, possibly kind of 18 months, but probably not much longer than that. And I actually did have the conversation several times, and I put one of the conversations in the book where I said to Jeremy, shall we stop? Shall we take the kids? We'll go around the world. We'll do whatever you want to do. We'll spend this time together. And he immediately said no. And he said no for two reasons. One is we were right in the middle of Brexit, and he was passionate about helping Mrs. May get through the end of that, or get as far along that as he could, which some people might think is utterly kind of crazy, but you've got to remember that this is somebody who was incredibly dedicated to what he did. There wasn't anyone immediately able to step in, and he felt very, very very bad about kind of stepping away kind of suddenly. I think there's another reason, though, that definitely was part of it, but there was another reason as well, which was for Jeremy, the longer he could keep working, the more that he could pretend that life was normal, and this awful, awful thing that was going to happen was somehow not going to happen. And the longer that he could kind of keep that up, the better. And that was how he coped with it. Now, not everyone would cope with it that way. I'm not sure I would recommend it to anybody. I certainly didn't believe, and his doctors never told me that it did anything material to affect his treatment. I mean, he made all the kind of treatment appointments and so on. And in fact, I was very lucky. I managed to get him on a trial, which actually made that year 18 months. So we got him a little bit more time. But for Jeremy, it was how he coped. While he was working on stuff, he could shove all the rest of it to one side and he could forget about it. And that's how he wanted to spend his time. He wanted to spend his time working, and the time he wasn't spending working, he was spending with me and the kids. And that was basically it. He kind of, those were his two areas of focus. It did, as you say, kind of lead to a very kind of odd dynamic, because Jeremy played this kind of slight game, which I describe in the book, of slightly pretending he wasn't ill. That, as a consequence, meant that every time I kind of tried to push a hospital appointment on him, there was a little bit of kind of, don't you realize how busy I am? You kind of put another appointment in my diary just when I'm doing something really important. But he knew that was a game, and I knew that was a game, and that was the kind of game he was playing to get himself through a very, very difficult situation. And it was something that, the Prime Minister supported as well. I mean, if he'd have said at any moment, I'm going to stop, Mrs. May would never, I am absolutely sure, have made him continue. I mean, but when he went to her and said, look, this is the situation, he was very honest with her about the situation, but I'm happy to keep working if you want me to keep working, she said yes, because she valued him. So would I recommend it to others? I think it depends so much on the individual person. It's what worked for him, and it's what he wanted to do.
He was a man of his time, but you mentioned that he lost a sibling. And you also mention, and I'm paraphrasing you there, but he was a man who coped with things by not talking about them. And there are people like that. It's not the future generation. It's certainly not the present generation's way of coping, but it was some individuals in his generations. It may have made things a little bit harder for you. And it strikes me that perhaps the book was a way for you as his wife to cope with coming to terms with the loss. But I may be wrong about that. But thank you for sharing, such very personal recollections with us. It did strike me that leading up to his death and the Brexit toxicity, shall we say, the toxic events of Brexit, I was shocked to read that you received, presumably in your office, a death threat, effectively. I mean, it's shocking. Tell us about that.
I did. I suddenly received one day, kind of in the post, a death threat, which was because of Jeremy. I mean, the kind of letter accompanying it said, remind your husband how this country voted, and there was a kind of bullet in the envelope, which was very, very shocking. And it came at it came right in the middle of everything else as well. So it came right in the middle of Jeremy being incredibly ill. In fact, it came almost at the moment where we discovered he'd moved from stage 3 to stage 4. So in an odd sort of way, it was just yet another thing, if it had happened out of a clear blue sky, I would have spent a lot of time worrying about it. As it was, I had so many other things to worry about. I just had to kind of accept the world at that point in time. I mean, it's very sad, whatever side of that debate you sat on, for some people it became very, very toxic. And I think that's very sad, because I think it's absolutely fine that we have our differences and, people debate differences. It's very sad when it becomes kind of personal, and particularly personal against civil servants, because as I hope I made clear in the book, civil servants don't decide things. What they do is they kind of implement them. And you're right about Jeremy. He didn't like to talk about things, but we did talk about things enough, I felt. I did sit him down, because I am a talker. I did sit him down and force him to talk about things. But the book was wonderful, because what the book gave us was a shared project that we could do together, which wasn't about talking about him being ill. And it, wasn't about trying to talk about the future, which of course was very difficult given where we were. But it was a chance to kind of go back and kind of relive all these stories. And a lot of them, there's a lot of humor in the book, because, quite often in the midst of great events of state happening, the kind of minutiae are very funny. And so I tried to capture quite a lot of that.
Well, you certainly captured one of them, which was it was to do with the comments on Anglo-Saxon capitalism and how somebody pulled the plug on Sarkozy when he was about to sort of launch things, perhaps a little prematurely. I've got a question here from Rob Hilton. Why was Jeremy reluctant to be the head of the civil service? Why was Jeremy reluctant to be head of a civil service, as although he had not run a department, he had excellent managerial skills?
So there were a couple of reasons for that. I mean, one is when Jeremy became cabinet secretary, unlike some of his predecessors, Jeremy kept part of his previous job alongside being cabinet secretary. So the job Jeremy was doing before he became cabinet secretary was to be the permanent secretary of 10 Downing Street, which actually was a role which had never existed before. And effectively, it meant the Prime Minister's lead policy advisor on everything. And when he became cabinet secretary, and the job of cabinet secretary is to run the cabinet, to organize the cabinet, if you like. The Prime Minister chairs the cabinet secretary organizes the cabinet, writes all the minutes for it, organizes the agendas for the kind of, the different kind of cabinet meetings and so on. When he became cabinet secretary, he remained as the Prime Minister's lead policy advisor. And so his first concern was he just wouldn't have enough time to do the job of being head of the civil service, which means line managing all the departments on top of doing those other two roles. But there was another reason. I mean, the other reason was, as the kind of questioner suggests, I mean, Jeremy, unlike most people who have become cabinet secretary, had not run a big department. And that was just a kind of, if you like, it had just been how his career had evolved. It hadn't involved going and running a big department. And therefore, he felt that he might not have the right skills. And he also felt that other people might feel he didn't have the right skills. I think there's a kind of third reason as well, which is actually, as I wrote Jeremy's kind of biography and I went back in time, it became very apparent that Jeremy actually, he wasn't one of these people who liked to be in the limelight. He liked to be the number two. He liked to be the person behind who was suggesting the good ideas and providing the support and, providing some guidance. He didn't really like to be the person standing at the front of the stage giving the speech. That wasn't his character. And so he liked the idea of being the cabinet secretary, thinking about the policy, having somebody else doing that kind of standing up and fronting the civil service job. However, what happened was that they appointed two different people to do those two roles. So alongside Jeremy, they appointed a head of the civil service. And inevitably, that kind of double-headed structure didn't work. I mean, it never does really work very well in organizations. And eventually, Jeremy became both. And somewhat to his surprise, he turned out to be rather good at it. I remember him saying, I still don't like giving speeches, but people seem to like them. And he was a very, very good manager, even though he never, up until that point, he'd never led a big organization. He was naturally a very good manager, I think.
He spent 3 years, right? He spent some time in investment banking, didn't he, with Morgan Stanley?
That's right.
That's right, Morgan Stanley, yes. Why did he leave?
Well, he left, so he'd been working for Tony Blair for several years, 4 or 5 years, which he absolutely loved. And they'd made a lot of progress, particularly on reforming public services, quite a lot of work on health issues as well. And then he was really ready to move on. And actually, that was the point where he could have run a big department, possibly. But it was kind of judged at the time that he wasn't really old enough. He was a bit young for his role at the time, partly because the early part of his career had been very accelerated. He worked with Norman Lamont in the Treasury, and Norman Lamont went from being financial secretary, which is like the number 3 ministerial role, to being chief secretary, number 2 role, to being chancellor in a very short period of time. And Jeremy ran Norman's office in all three roles. And so Jeremy kind of got accelerated alongside Norman. The result of that was he actually ended up being very young for the roles that he was playing. And when he got to the end of the period when he was working for Tony Blair, and by that point he was the principal private secretary at 10 Downing Street, he was ready to go and run a department, but he was a bit too young. And so the suggestion was made that he should go outside and go do something else. So he went and worked at Morgan Stanley for 4 or 5 years, which coincidentally turned out to be a very good thing, because of course he came back into government at Gordon Brown's request in 2007, and that was just before the financial crisis. And that kind of banking knowledge that Jeremy gained from being in Morgan Stanley turned out to be incredibly helpful, because it did mean that he understood, at least to some degree, how that crisis was affecting the banking system and what needed to be done about it.
So I think that we had a question from Russell Ecob. Was Jeremy's move to banking a wise move in retrospect? But you're telling us that he then had to deal with the financial crisis. And in fact, Britain came out showing leadership, did it not, with that whatever it was?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Gordon Brown did an incredible job, and I think hopefully that's clear in the book, and kind of leading a lot of the policy thinking through the financial crisis. And Jeremy was right at the heart of that as well. And I think that the knowledge that he gained from being at Morgan Stanley was incredibly valuable. And I actually think it is, more generally, I think it's incredibly helpful for people to move outside of whatever area they're in, if they get the opportunity to do so, and then kind of come back in, because you learn so much. I mean, I know in my own career, I've kind of, I had an early period of my career in the civil service, in the Treasury, which is where Jeremy and I met. I had a large part of my career in McKinsey, and then I've now moved. I'm working at this company, Exor. And each time I've moved, I felt like I've been on an accelerated learning curve. In a way that I wouldn't have been if I'd just stayed in one place. So he always thought that time had been incredibly kind of valuable, but I always thought he would go back into the civil service, and indeed he did.
I've got a question here about you and about CNH Industrial, the company for which he chairs, turns over 25 billion euros last year, 63,000 employees. Are you more important than Lord Heywood, Lady Heywood, is the question. Well, perhaps you don't have to answer that.
Yeah,
we've said behind every great woman, man.
I've been very, very lucky to be involved in both kind of Exor and CNH Industrial, both kind of great companies, I have to say. And lucky to have the kind of opportunity to kind of lead those companies, particularly over the last kind of year or 18 months. They've been very, very, it's been a very tough period. But actually, the company, CNH Industrial has come out of that in a good way. So it's been a kind of huge experience. And I'm sad in a way that Jeremy wasn't around to see me have to do that, because I think he would have been very kind of proud, and I would have been incredibly grateful to get his advice. Because as I said earlier, one of the things that we always did was consult each other and talk to each other about what's going on. And I really missed that.
And I've got a comment here from Howard Lyons. I come from the private sector and experienced great frustration working with the civil service. Quite a lot of similarities between medicine and civil service, aren't there? But anyway, that's not what he says here. This is what I'm saying. Now, Jeremy helped me cut through the civil service process to establish Healthcare UK under Ken Clark and Jeremy Hunt. He helped me set up. Sorry, I haven't got my glasses because I've dropped them, so I'm having trouble reading this. I do apologise. Very sad. You can see the questions. Help me set a course and never failed to keep in touch. How did he manage to keep so many balls in the air whilst apparently not dropping any, or did he?
And that was, I have to say, Jeremy had many skills. He was also missing, as I kind of said earlier, he was missing a few skills as well, particularly anything practical. But one of the things that he was incredible at was keeping many, many things going at once. I don't know quite how his brain worked, but he would send hundreds of emails a day, I suspect. And often, he would do is he would connect people. He would ping off a quick email to say, what's happening on this issue, or have you talked to so-and-so, or I've met this interesting person, you need to kind of talk to them. These are often short connecting bits, and he saw his role kind of sitting there in the middle. That's something that he could do, and he often would be the person who would know that there was somebody in the Department of Health who was doing something interesting. And wouldn't it be really interesting if they talked to somebody who he'd met who was working as a consultant in a hospital, or somebody in a dementia charity, or whatever it would be, and he would connect these different parts together. And that was one of the things he was remarkable at doing. The other thing he was remarkable at doing was being in the moment. So the thing with Jeremy, if you know, and I think this often happens when people are like that, is you never really feel like you get their attention, because they're always flitting from one thing to another, or checking their emails or whatever it was. He was very good at focusing on whatever it was he was doing in that moment. So he was able simultaneously to throw a lot of balls in the air. And secondly, actually, when you were talking to him, to be incredibly present. And those are two skills which I really kind of recognized in him, and things which I certainly try to do, though I'm nowhere near as good at it as he was.
Now we must talk about health, because time is running out, and we are, after all, doctors. And COVID, so Brexit was succeeded, or has COVID-19, and there've been a lot of criticism of handling of COVID-19, particularly the troublesome, the issues with public health during COVID-19. And there is a school of view that all stems back to the Lansley reorganization, which took public health away and put the directors of public health back into local authority. But it was just after the financial crisis. We lost a lot of our public health directors, a lot of funding. And as a result, there was a mismatch, and there was very poor communication. So Jeremy, what was Jeremy's views on Lansley? I mean, you have a lovely comment on Jeremy read through the white paper and struggled to see what the issue was that this scale of change was trying to fix. So was it just change for the sake of change?
No, I don't think it was change for the sake of change. I think kind of Andrew Lansley, and this is me talking as me, not me talking as Jeremy, but I think, you know, from the research that I did and from everyone who I spoke to, I think that Andrew Lansley came in and he had a very clear vision for what he wanted to do. And it wasn't just change for change's sake. He did have a vision of kind of pushing decision-making much, you know, down into the system much more than it was before, and trying to take decision-making away from politicians so that it was done more by kind of people who could make the right choices. I think kind of Jeremy's concern with it, and I do describe it, you know, reasonably, you know, as honestly as I could in the book, you know, Jeremy's reaction to those reforms and what Jeremy tried to do. And it is a good example of where, you know, he saw these reforms, he highlighted some of the issues that he could see with them. He worked very hard behind the scenes to try and mitigate some of the kind of issues he could see with the changes. And I think largely he would say that he failed. You know, he got a little bit changed, but this was a situation where you had a minister who had the complete backing of the Prime Minister in these reforms. And in that case, you know, it's the job of the civil service to point out concerns. It's the job of ministers to make decisions. And the decision was taken to kind of, by and large, move forward with the reforms as they were initially proposed. I think one of the biggest regrets that Jeremy had in the kind of health space, and it applies to the Lansley reforms, but it applies more generally, is that he never managed to find a way to reform the funding of social care. And sadly, I think kind of what's happened in the last kind of year or 18 months with COVID has highlighted, you know, what a kind of, in a way, what a failing that was. And he would, if he was here, I think he would feel kind of terrible about that. I mean, he tried on multiple occasions to look for ways to reform the funding of social care, to get the funding of social care onto a much better footing than it was. Because, of course, as everybody listening to this knows, you know, we have that, it's so different, our kind of primary and kind of social care systems and the way in which they're funded. But he never really managed to get that sorted, despite kind of multiple attempts. And actually, one of his regrets with the kind of Lansley reforms was that they didn't really, in any meaningful way, cover social care. So it was a missed opportunity on social care. And it was such a painful experience, you know, the kind of Health and Social Care Act, somewhat misnamed, I would argue, that, you know, he said at the end of it, and I say in the book, you know, nobody's going to come back and do another big health reform for at least another decade. And it's true, you know, if you've been through that experience, people are then very reluctant to come back and address things again. And so today, as we know, that's still an issue that needs to be addressed.
Thank you for raising that issue. I've got a question from Jeremy Clark about his work with Lord Richard Layard. I'm not familiar on that work, with that work.
Yeah, and I do mention that in the book. And
I should be.
Yeah, well, I only mentioned it briefly. I mean, one of the things with the book, of course, is the book is covering such a long period of time and such a lot of different policies that many things I had to leave out, actually, which kind of felt less important, including, interestingly, kind of green stuff. Or I just mentioned them in passing, because otherwise I was just worried I was going to, you know, it was just going to be an avalanche of stuff for the reader. But Jeremy Clark is right. You know, Jeremy worked with Richard Layard on kind of mental health issues. So one of the things that when the coalition government came in, that they were concerned to try and make progress on, rightly, was mental health, which is one of those areas of health which historically has been somewhat neglected. I think less so now, thankfully, but it was quite neglected. And Jeremy worked with Richard Layard to try and think about how to bring in and provide better funding for things like CBT, which I think they made quite a lot of progress on. More progress to be made there, but I think that was a big step forward. Likewise, Jeremy also did quite a lot of work also under the coalition, thinking about Alzheimer's and dementia. Sadly, his mother suffers from both, actually. So it was something he knew a lot about and felt very strongly about. And actually, David Cameron did as well. And it's another one of those areas which is just not, you know, it's one that people had neglected. You know, it's not as interesting or kind of as amenable as kind of other kind of forms of health problems, but they managed to get that really reformed, a lot more money channeled into research in that area, which hopefully will over time make things better.
Back to a personal note, Lady Heywood, I've got a question here from David McKinley. Have your children taken to sailing? Do you still sail, or do you hate it?
Well, I have a love-hate relationship with sailing. I mean, having sailed for so much of my life and having been in some extremely frightening experiences, this can be a kind of plug for my next book, which will come out. Yeah. But you know, having been shipwrecked in the middle of the Indian Ocean in pretty kind of horrific circumstances, I have a very healthy respect for the sea. You know, I know what the sea can be like when it wants to be. When it wants to be bad. But I also love sailing. I mean, it is a wonderful thing to be on a boat, you know, to kind of pull up the sails, and it's kind of silent. And if you get out, you know, in the middle of the ocean and you look up, it's the most incredible view that you will, you know, that you'll ever see, that you'll never see on land.
Is that the landscape of your childhood, Lady Heywood? You had such an extraordinary childhood. You know, obviously our parents are the landscape, but I mean the physical landscape of your childhood. I was really struck, I'm interrupting you, but a passage in your book when you were trying to conceive, and you mentioned that cabin in the, you know, it's a very touching moment, and I hope you don't mind me mentioning it, but you mentioned that cabin, wood cabin in the forest, and you're visualizing holding the child you so long for. Where's the landscape of your childhood? Is it the ocean?
Yes, no, absolutely. It's kind of sitting on a boat surrounded by sea. And when you sit in the middle of the ocean and you look around, you can literally see the horizon, which is something else that you don't normally see in our lives. You don't see the horizon. Sit on a boat, you look around and you can see the horizon like a circle all the way around you. And if you look up and if it's dark, you get this incredible view of the stars. Absolutely extraordinary. I mean, incredibly bright in a way that you don't appreciate in the kind of life that we lead here. So I actually went back and I got my Yachtmaster certificate, Yachtmaster Offshore certificate, which was an opportunity for me to prove to myself that I could still sail. And my children have done some sailing, but not a lot. And I'd love to take them to do some more. but I'm not intending to take them off for a decade. I think they're probably quite glad to hear that.
And we've got a question here on how much influence have their parents' careers had on them. And I think you mentioned that that your eldest is, Jeremy read history and economics, is that right? And your eldest is reading history.
That's right. That's right. So my eldest is reading history. I think my kind of middle child, I think she may well end up doing kind of philosophy, but we will see. And my youngest is a scientist. I think he may end up being a biochemist or something like that, or maybe even a doctor.
Good. Well, we would welcome vision in our ranks. We have plenty already, but we would welcome that. Now, I think time is running short. I'm sorry I haven't been able to address everybody's questions, but I want to just end with this book. I found it fascinating because it's about events that have happened so very recently, written by a source who was so close to the events and to the power behind the events. But it's also a very personal book, and I think we've touched on elements of that this evening. Lady Heywood, when you left the Treasury, there was a comment about fluffiness. You weren't fluffy enough. So I'm going to end on a fluffy note this evening. And my fluffy note, if you'll allow it, is to take you back to your honeymoon on the banks of Lake Garda. And I'm going to have to paraphrase the quote, but you're sitting with Jeremy on the banks of Lake Garda and it's dark and you're looking at the lights, and Jeremy says to you, each light represents a lifetime of love. And if you add them together, that is how much I love you. And it strikes me, Lady Heywood, that these are your lights in this book, and a tribute to the man you loved and respected. And I'm extremely grateful for you for sharing this with us this evening. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
We have some housekeeping before we say goodbye to Lady Heywood this evening. Firstly, to remind you that tomorrow, COVID-19 series is looking at the third wave in Europe. Next Wednesday's In Conversation live with Henrietta will be interviewing Claire Gerarda. She's going to be talking about the Family Practitioner Health Program, addiction in doctors, and doctors' mental health and mental PPE for doctors. And then on Tuesday, we have our third climate change symposium on a subject close to my heart, which is skin in a warming world. Finally, I mentioned at the beginning that this has been a challenging year. It's been a challenging year for the RSM. The RSM needs your help. So please donate. You can donate either using the QR code on the screen now, or you can donate by going to the website. Lady Heywood, should we use the words of George Osborne?
I think so. I think we should ask people to dig deep and donate.
Thank you very much indeed. So thank you, Lady Heywood, and thank you all for listening tonight. Good evening.